liking, or sharing an incited charge of a covert scheme creates a connection to others who accept this compromised sense of reality. If a lot of people are saying it, it's true enough. Unfounded conspiracy theories do not foster discussion, but rather draw oxygen from its flame by discouraging reasoned engagement. This is because rampant misinformation hurts the search for a shared truth by purposefully muddying the waters. The Brookings Institution explains, the flow of misinformation is a function of both human and technical factors. We're more likely to react to content that taps into our existing grievances and beliefs, in which inflammatory tweets will generate quick engagement. If a tweet is retweeted, favorited, or replied to enough by enough of its first viewers, it will tap into the biases of those users too, prompting even more engagement. This cycle can turn social media into a kind of confirmation bias machine, one perfectly tailored for the spread of misinformation. Individuals who knowingly spread misinformation are not interested in having an open and honest discussion. Our opponents may claim that we are somehow enforcing an ecosystem where only accepted thought is welcome. In fact, the opposite is true. Misinformation attempts to fragment truth, so different groups can remain in separate spheres of discussion, content to ignore the other side because they have their facts wrong, which leads to our second contention, in which misinformation undermines democracy. A huge portion of Americans get their political news and information from social media. According to Pew Research, 68% of American adults say they at least occasionally get news on social media. In addition, a poll conducted by NPR found that 80% of Americans are concerned about the spread of misinformation online. Therefore, misinformation on these platforms presents a substantial threat to accurate, transparent information for citizens. Jennifer Jarrett, in the Annual Review of Political Science, writes in May of 2020, the misinformed base their political opinions on inaccurate beliefs. When large segments of the public are misinformed in the same direction, shared misperceptions can systematically bias collective opinion, undermining the idea that errors in individual level preferences cancel out in the aggregate. Misinformed people take political action on the basis of incorrect information. Some of the most pernicious forms of misinformation are grounding in a person's standing political commitments. And this logic is reinforced by empirical data. And in his research on political misinformation on social media in Spain, Professor Paul Carr from the University of Quebec finds that misinformation on social media in Spain affected democracy as it discouraged citizens' interests and participation in political debate, processes, decision-making and development, and also generate distrust, cynicism, and disengagement from the formal electoral system. Misinformation leads to disengagement from discussion and democratic practices, as has been observed in case studies like Spain. Which leads to our third and final contention. Contention 3, legislation would legitimize political extremism. FBI Director Christopher Wray recently told the Senate Intelligence Committee, social media has become, in many ways, the key amplifier to domestic violent extremism, just as it has for malign foreign influence. The same things that attract people to it for good reasons are also capable of causing all kinds of harms that we are entrusted with trying to protect the American people against. The Wall Street Journal reports in January, a collection of extremist personalities loudly rallied their online followings to contest the election results through violence if necessary. Many of them use the reach of mainstream social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, but increasingly also turn to niche sites with fewer rules around the type of content that can be posted. There are extremist political viewpoints that are a direct danger to the public and have been shown to gain traction on social media platforms. There has to be a moderation of this, but that cannot be done if legislation is passed. Finn and I highly value democratic values such as political speech and having your own political viewpoint. But there are political viewpoints that try to undermine these core principles for other groups. Since the expression of certain political viewpoints can lead to misinformation and political extremism that undermines our democracy, we proudly negate.
Okay, let's begin round 2, the cross-examination. For the affirmative team, the negative team argued that legislation will actually legitimize political extremism. How would you respond?
We would say that legislation does quite the opposite. in that when people are censored on larger social media platforms, they often go to more underground communities where they become radicalized. If there is a ban, if there is a prevention and protection from banning those people, it means they're more likely to be exposed to alternate perspectives on larger platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And as our evidence points out, when people become censored, there are numerous factors that lead to those people becoming radicalized because of that censorship, because of group identity fusion, echo chambers, as well as the idea in criminology that when someone is labeled as a deviant, they adopt those characteristics and adopt that identity to keep themselves static. So it is our firm belief that censoring people based on political beliefs means that there will be less discourse in the public forums of the 21st century.
And to the negative team, how would you respond to that?
We disagree that what is radicalizing people is being labeled as deviants. Instead, we think the evidence points strongly towards misinformation being the primary mechanism by which people are being radicalized. Our opponents have this claim that somehow we are creating echo chambers. I would say that in the status quo, where regulation of these platforms is pretty much non-existent, you have these echo chambers created because, again, misinformation is fragmenting truth. So one side is content to say, hey, the other side has their facts wrong. We don't even need to talk to them. So putting a blanket protection on all political speech would be putting a blanket protection on misinformation. And we are robbing ourselves of an ability in the future to regulate this kind of harmful speech that we've shown has really negative impacts for democratic processes and democratic discourse.
And to the affirmative side, how would you respond to the contention that misinformation is creating radicalization?
We definitely agree that misinformation is a key problem when it comes to radicalization. However, we think that without legislation, it will only get worse, mainly because there is regulation on social media platforms, but they're not from the government or any external actor. They're from the social media companies themselves that have specific incentives to regulate the kind of speech on their platforms based on one political side or the other. This means that without legislation, certain swaths of people on larger platforms will become banned and not be able to interact with other perspectives. Moreover, we don't think that people should be banned because of ignorance and misinformation, and that access to larger platforms will mean that there is an increased chance that they'll be corrected or that their perspective will change or others can engage in discourse with them. Although misinformation is a problem, it's a problem that we can correct with more speech, not less.
And how would you respond to the negative team to that?
I would say that misinformation is the primary problem, as you pointed out, and I think that regulation is required. But the regulation that our opponents are advocating for is a step backwards. As I said earlier, it's putting a blank check protection on, as the Supreme Court defines, an extremely broad category of speech. The Supreme Court even ends its definition by saying matters of opinion. So if someone has a politics-related opinion, it basically couldn't be related. It couldn't be regulated on social media. So you would see that rampant misinformation could not be checked if we pass this type of blank check protection.
How would you respond, affirmative side?
We think that because social media platforms are the public forums of the 21st century, that the Supreme Court has also established in Packingham versus North Carolina, banning would do more net harm to the spread of misinformation and the creation of political echo chambers. And then, in fact, engaging and ensuring that people can speak and interact with each other on the large platforms that define public discourse is what is key. And while we agree that political speech is quite broad, we interpret it to mean speech protected by the government on platforms because we define them as public forums. When we define social media platforms as public forums, it means that our speech on those platforms are constitutionally protected insofar as they aren't inciting or hate rhetoric. So in that way, it means that people can interact more cleanly on those public forums without echo chambers created by people going underground when they become censored or dropping off the face of mainstream communication platforms.
But fundamentally speaking, you talk about a lot about echo chambers and creating these like areas in which there's safe knowledge, but we don't see that, right? Like, remember how I brought up in our case, the case study in Spain from Professor Paul Carr, in which we see what happens when you don't regulate this misinformation, right? You have people, they're not in like coming out of these echo chambers. In fact, if anything, this misinformation only reinforces these echo chambers because it forces people into separate spheres of thought, because you allow all this misinformation to go about, you create more tension, you start creating more polarization as a result, because you just muddy the waters on what is actually fact.
Yeah.
How would you respond, affirmative side, Christian?
Yeah. Ultimately, I think that we're talking about this idea of banning people off of social media platforms because of the things that they post there. I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're talking about this. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that if you ban somebody off of some platform like Facebook for spreading misinformation, that person doesn't just go away. You haven't actually solved the problem. Instead, they tend to move to other smaller social networking platforms like Gab, where you can take somebody who gets banned for spreading misinformation about, for example, an election, and then ultimately what ends up happening is they become more and more radicalized with more and more intense misinformation until you end up with something like neo-Nazism or other extreme ideologies on both sides of the political spectrum. So yeah, the alternative here is that we keep them on the platform where there are people who actually disagree, so that they can engage in that free marketplace of ideas, so that they can face opposing opinions, not from some large entity who gets to decide what's true and what's not, but from other people who can convince them using the truth of their ideas that they're incorrect, that what they're spreading is misinformation.
I want to draw an analogy to respond to this. So let's look at the public forums of the 20th century, right? So you have news organizations that are spreading information. News organizations reserve the right, through their freedom of association, to present certain information. And the reason that we allow them to do that is because we hold them a bit accountable, right? We hold them accountable for spreading misinformation. And if we tell social media companies that are really becoming news organizations in and of themselves through the algorithms and through what they put in front of people, if we tell them, hey, you cannot ban political misinformation, how are we supposed to hold them accountable when they are spreading misinformation if we tell them that, hey, you can't regulate this at all, or the government, even if we pass this regulation, couldn't come in and regulate it? So I think that there needs to be a system of accountability in these social media organizations, and that would include some of the smaller ones that people are running to in these cases. So we need a system of accountability, and you can't have a system of accountability if you write blank check protections for all these forms of speech. Currently, news organizations, say Fox News or CNN, they get the freedom of association to decide who comes on their platform, and they try to regulate misinformation like that. I think that a similar system needs to be put in place for the news organizations of the 21st century, which are going to be social media organizations.
The affirmative side, how would you address accountability, or how does your affirmation address accountability?
I think there's a distinct difference. I think the question is important, and I think there's a distinct difference between what the negative is talking about in terms of a news company. Fox News and CNN, individual people, public, just the general public cannot talk on those shows. Those shows are not mouthpieces for everyday people, but social media platforms are. This means that the accountability on social media platforms are everyone else, other people in the community. It's not a regulated stream of information from a singular media company, but rather a public forum. We would say that social media companies are public forums in the sense of a public park could be a public forum, or the city hall could be a public forum, or the streets could be a public forum as well, which is quite distinct from distilled streams of information that come from conventional news organizations. That is what we mean by a public forum, which is why we think it's distinctly different in the question of accountability. In this instance, everyone holds everyone else accountable as much as they can.
I think it's interesting that the affirmative wants accountability for these social media organizations when, for example, they claim that they're censoring conservative voices, but they're not willing to accept accountability for these social media organizations when they're spreading rampant misinformation that can lead to, for example, the Capitol riots. So we see actually tangible effects of misinformation. And I think accountability needs to be held up when there are tangible effects. And we can see the tangible effects through empirical evidence of misinformation. And we really do need to have a system of accountability with the news organizations of the future. I know they're a little bit different, but this is the future of news, is on social media platforms. That's where the data is telling us, especially young people. Majority of young people are getting most of their news from social media.
Yeah, and as we've seen actually, as James Piazza had wrote further, that when we allow these kinds of environments of like these hateful political viewpoints, stuff like that to exist, it starts to create the more political polarization, in which that opens up a whole entire can of worms that leads to more problems. So really what the negative here is trying to say is that there are these political viewpoints out there that attempt to spread misinformation, divide us further as a country, and even in some of them look to instill violence. These are the types of things that need to be banned, because these political viewpoints, they're not advancing any sort of democracy or trying to create a roundtable discussion of ideas. Rather, instead, it's just putting us into these spheres of discussion that I find it funny that the affirmative keeps talking about echo chambers. Well, they're just merely advocating for more echo chambers, because you allow for that misinformation and division. That same environment that we see right now, they're allowing it to continue to persist.
On the affirmative side, how would you respond?
We would say that echo chambers exist. They exist in the status quo. They exist currently on social media platforms, but without ensuring that there is some sort of measure put in place to discourage echo chambers would be a massive disadvantage for the United States in attempting to curb a political polarization. Without ensuring that people can engage with each other on public forums, regardless of their viewpoint, unless it is hateful and inciting rhetoric, of course, it means that echo chambers will only get worse unless we ensure that speech is protected by the First Amendment in a public forum.
I think it's really important to understand what the affirmative is doing here is that they are codifying and legitimizing the status quo. The negative is advocating that this is a step backwards, right? That codifying the status quo, legitimizing the status quo in this way is a step backwards. We instead need to be looking forwards. So I want the judges to bear that in mind when they're looking at solvency in this round of the affirmative is, advocating for the status quo in a lot of ways and is codifying.
And I would like also to add on to Finn's point there, is that they're advocating for the status quo, and they're also just pushing more for like this political extremism that we see. That's not going to go away with by banning moderation. You just allow it to get worse, right? You allow it to go unchecked no matter what.
The negative side, how do you address the contention that social media is the public forum of the 21st century?
We would say that while it is a public forum, social media companies in of themselves have the right to regulate it, because they are a private company. You're not, when everyone's born, you're not given a Facebook account or Twitter account like we all are. You have to sign up for that type of stuff. So these people are also choosing to engage in using the services of these social media companies as well. So that in of itself creates a decision of agreement between users and the company themselves. People have to agree to the kinds of things that social media companies, their policies, everyone has terms of service.
And even if you ignore this freedom of association argument, public forums have always had some form of regulation. If we're going to draw the analogy of speech as a market, I believe in a lot of free market ideals, but there's not a great outcome for a completely free market, absolutely no regulation involved. You need to have some regulation, because as Stanley Fish points out, the right to the freedom of speech isn't just the right to make noise. It's trying to have a productive discourse. And so having these regulations, for example, on misinformation is absolutely critical to furthering productive speech. And so if we're going to have this new public forum, we think there needs to be some guidelines. And this is taking a step backwards rather than forwards in making those guidelines.
How would you respond to the affirmative side?
So I think something that we want to keep track of here is what each side is really advocating for. Right now, in the status quo, we do allow social media companies to ban pretty much whoever they want on their websites. The important thing to note about our argument is that we think they're doing a bad job. So when we're talking about accountability for social media sites, like we've been doing this whole round, we would say we should hold social media sites accountable for the biased and arbitrary decisions that they make when they ban people essentially just based on political viewpoint. I think I'm not entirely sure how the negative would actually do anything to stop the companies involved here that are really causing a lot of these harms, and hold those companies accountable rather than just private citizens who want to speak their minds on those sites.
So I want to be clear, I'm not saying that the current law is that these social media companies can't ban users based on political opinion. We contend that social media companies right now aren't banning users based on political opinion. And there has been no evidence presented that there are like wide-scale bans of users based off of political opinion. We're saying that this is a step backwards because it's stopping a process of regulation. Moving forward, our country has realized that social media companies and these marketplaces are leading to some bad outcomes in a lot of ways, especially with misinformation. And we need to address this somehow. The solution isn't stop any future discussion about regulation on these platforms by just writing a blank check protection for all of the speech on them. That's what I'm saying when I'm saying that we're codifying the status quo. But just to clarify on that.
Respond.
I was gonna, if it would be okay, I actually have a question for the affirmative, if they could. They talk a lot about accountability, and I would really like to know if we don't ban specific users based on their political viewpoints. Christian, I know you brought up neo-Nazis and stuff like that. So how do we actually hold these like groups that have a history of not necessarily willing to work with others or create productive discourse? How do we actually hold them accountable then on social media websites if they can't be banned?
Well, the First Amendment does say that the First Amendment does protect speech unless it is hate or inciting rhetoric, in which case the speech of groups like neo-Nazis advocating for the genocide of marginalized groups would not be protected in social media platforms as a public forum. The resolution is specifically about is political speech, and by speech protected by the government, we very much mean speech that is not hate speech or inciting rhetoric, which isn't protected.
Yeah, and as far as how we would hold accountable, the answer to that is by arguing with them, by explaining to them why their ideas are wrong. Ultimately, the solution to this sort of misinformation, of course, that isn't like actively violent or directly inciting, is not going to be to just shut it down and try to push it into a corner, because that corner is also where all of the other neo-Nazis are hiding out. The solution is to engage with it directly and try to, get in the free marketplace of ideas and have truth come out on top.
I think what our opponents are missing is the massive amplification that social media grants these extremist groups. So in the evidence that Vincent brought up in the case from the FBI director and from others, we see that social media is a giant megaphone for these extremist groups to call their forces all together. And so while we may be excluding them from that, we would rather take that than allowing them this massive platform from which to shout. And frankly, that's the whole point of freedom of association. If Twitter, for example, doesn't want to be associated with a neo-Nazi party that is spreading messages of Holocaust denial or anti-Jewish sentiment or calls to violence, they have the right to say, no, you don't get to use our platform to spread this message. And you can still have the right to say those things. We just don't think they have a right to the platform that these social media companies provide. And that platform is what's really harmful here.
To the affirmative side, how do you address the company's freedoms of association to not want to associate with such speech?
We think that if we create public forums, such as social media websites that have become the public forums of the 21st century, companies don't have to claim liability on those things. The government protects speech there, and the hate speech that is there can be banned, which means that they wouldn't be associated with Nazi groups because that kind of speech is not speech protected under the First Amendment in a public forum.
Team, how does you respond?
You are advocating that that speech be protected. That is the entire affirmative's point, is that any political viewpoint is now protected, that we can't have accountability because they can't ban them. It is completely protected, blanket protection. So I think you're contradicting yourself a bit when you're saying that this speech is not allowed. In fact, the affirmative is further enabling this speech that is currently allowed to be codified even further.
And I think, like, adding on to Finn's point, like, what's important, I think, at the bottom line of this debate is to show on whether or not these groups are actually like going towards these more extremist positions. Both teams in this round have said that even right now, when there is moderation, we still see that. And even when there is no moderation, that trend continues. So what you as judges have to look at here in this debate is which side allows for some sort of moderation to ensure that all of these effects that us four are up here arguing about, these horrible, nasty effects, that they don't come to fruition. We see that if you take away the one fighting chance that these social media companies have at fighting misinformation or this extremism from developing, the affirmative in this debate, they're only making their issues a lot worse. You create a more extremist environment in which you can't even regulate about it. That's the bottom line. The affirmative is simply unable.
Point. This is not to say that social media companies can no longer ban anyone for any reason. It isolates the individual reason of political viewpoint. Now, social media companies would still be able to ban people who engage in very insightful and violent rhetoric. That's not because of their political viewpoint that they uphold. That's because of the actual content of the speech that they engage in.
Responses to that. The first is that the definition that we offer from the Supreme Court and that the Supreme Court offers of political speech is extremely broad. It even ends with public opinion. And second, if you're saying that you can objectively distinguish between a political viewpoint and, say, a factual viewpoint, you are showing some sort of partisanship, right? Everything is up for debate in politics. And because of the Supreme Court's broad definition of what is political in this country, state sections to the speech on social media platforms. And you have to acknowledge that that is creating this very broad definition of what couldn't be regulated.
How would you respond? Affirmative side?
Yeah. Yeah, Mel, go ahead.
Oh, I would just like to reemphasize that when we extend First Amendment protections to online forums like social media companies, it means that hateful and inciting rhetoric like that of Nazi groups is not protected and can be banned. That is a form of regulation. We just think that social media companies are doing a very inconsistent and arbitrary job of doing it. This piece of legislation specifically ensures that there are First Amendment protections to speech on social media. And the First Amendment is, although it grants many freedoms, it is still limited in what exactly it protects. Moreover, we think that this question of accountability is incredibly important, and we would like to, again, allude to the idea of the free market of ideas. A free market is inherently free, and it means that on social media platforms that are the public forums of the 21st century, much of the regulation that can occur is from the public and from other ideas in a more collective market, which means that regulation will exist. It is just not the arbitrary and politically biased ones of social media companies.
I think what's important to understand is that there has to be this like regulation in which you give social media companies, because this whole entire idea about the free market of ideas only goes so far in application. As we cited, when we look specifically at Spain, in which we observe the effects of social media and political viewpoints and misinformation, we see that there's not these benefits that the affirmative is talking about happening. And this is the real world. We see that people are being discouraged because of these different political viewpoints going on. There's not productive discourse, period. And we're not seeing any productive political development. Instead, we're seeing them thrown into these echo chambers. The affirmative keeps talking about how they're going to solve for echo chambers. But in application, in the status quo, in real life, through data, we see that isn't possible. You take away the moderation, you just simply throw people now more into echo chambers. You allow for that misinformation, and these chambers to only get stronger, and that's not solving anything at the end of the day.
Negative team, how do you address the affirmative's argument that the regulation has been arbitrary so far?
So I would say we have to look to the consequences in this debate in terms of the weighing. Our opponents have brought up kind of vague evidence about how there is an anti-conservative bias, but they haven't brought out any impacts of that, right? It's the impacts that we care about. It's the effect on human lives. So if you look at the impacts on the negative side, you see a huge negative impact to discourse. You see a massive negative impact to democracy. You see threats to democratic transitions of power. And these are tangible things that misinformation is doing, and that First Amendment limitations do absolutely nothing to protect on these social media sites where they're being used as amplifications for extremist political views, and if not direct calls to violence, insinuations of violence that are not going to be able to be banned. So I think you have to look at the impact of each side in weighing this, and that's where we draw the line on this.
How would you respond?
I'm sorry.
Affirmative side, how would you respond?
Oh, right. I think that when it comes down to the basic facts is that social media companies have bias. Our article outlines how exactly bias is integrated, in that most of the members of social media companies are of the more left-wing variety of politics. This means that biases when it comes to the regulation of content gets ingrained in the algorithms that are used to decide what is and what is not good content, which is obvious liberal bias. But it also points to studies which indicate that the way that search terms are used on social media platforms, as well as larger search engines, are specifically biased against conservative viewpoints. We would also argue that because social media companies have arbitrary decision-making and they haven't applied the frameworks and terms of conditions they use equally to different people, it means that they have complete control over the discourse that shapes our society. They have the power to create echo chambers by censoring some people of one viewpoint and some of another, justifying it by claiming that they have complete control over their platform. Making things public forums means that censorship of certain groups of people doesn't become possible in the future. Because when people are censored, as our evidence indicates, they are more likely to go into more condensed and dangerous echo chambers that are not visible to the light of day of public discourse.
I think that the real danger of algorithms and the tangible danger of algorithms is actually the amplification of misinformation, because frankly, a startling headline that is wrong gets a lot more clicks. And that's what the algorithm is paying attention to here, right? And that's the bigger problem that we need to solve. That's what's actually creating these echo chambers. I'd also like to point out that on the negative side, we're not opposed to government regulation that takes a step forward in regulating misinformation and bias, right? We're not opposed to that, but we're saying that the affirmative is advocating for government regulation that takes a step backwards and doesn't have that discussion. It just puts a blank check protection that doesn't deal with the bigger issue, which is the misinformation, because again, we see the impacts of that are much larger.
Alrighty, thank you. This concludes the second round of the debate, and we're now going to be moving on to the third round, and we will start with the affirmative side to begin the closing argument. Thank you.
All right, is anybody not ready?
Ready for you.
We proudly affirm the resolution that legislation should be passed that prevents social media companies from banning people based on political viewpoints. This helps protect free speech and the formation of echo chambers while checking the arbitrary decision-making made by social media companies. There are three key issues in today's debate that I would like to address. The first is on the question of public forums. The negative has agreed with us that social media companies are the public forums of the 21st century, and that we can extend the First Amendment protections to public forums. Now, the First Amendment is still limited and still has regulations that check things like hate rhetoric and inciting speech, meaning that platforms don't have to be associated with things like neo-Nazi groups. Moreover, public forums mean that social media platforms specifically are like parks and streets, meaning that it's important that we have public discourse in those spaces that is a foundation of our democracy. Now, the second key point is the idea of misinformation and echo chambers. First, I would like to continue the idea that extending First Amendment protection to social media platforms doesn't mean that we allow hate speech and inciting rhetoric. Rather, it means that people can have viewpoints without social media companies censoring them unless they are hateful, incite violence, and illegal action. And we would like to contend that misinformation becomes worse without legislation. In larger platforms like Facebook and Twitter, people are exposed to more diverse perspectives. But if they are banned arbitrarily by social media companies, a potential occurrence that could shift discourse that is foundational to our democracy, it means those people will likely either move to more condensed platforms where there are fewer, if not any, other perspectives contrary to theirs, or to underground forums where nothing is regulated at all. This means that echo chambers become more dangerous because it becomes a complete echo chamber. There is no perspective, and people will be more likely to radicalize. I would like to address the affirmative's argument about social media platforms being a megaphone. And while I do acknowledge that social media can help create echo chambers, unless we pass this legislation, that will get worse. Moreover, the fact that more clicks gets more attention means that there's more likely to be more refutation and more discourse about that media. It means that experts can come in and say exactly why that piece of media is incorrect. Moreover, when it comes to the regulation of social media platforms, it shouldn't fall to the arbitrariness of the terms of conditions from Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg, but rather it should focus on specific legal frameworks, such as hate speech and inciting rhetoric being banned, while allowing political viewpoints to flourish and engage in actual discourse. Moreover, they cite this example of Spain, and honestly, I do not think it's a persuasive one for me because Spain doesn't have the same protections through the First Amendment exactly as the United States. Our evidence is contextualized specifically to the extension of the First Amendment over social media platforms as public forums specifically. And because there are public forums, it ensures that individuals have the right to free speech and free expression while not harming the associational biases and images of companies because of that legislation action. And that brings me to the third point, which is the question of accountability. The negative may claim that with the affirmatives legislation, there is no accountability, but that's not true at all. The First Amendment itself has accountability, preventing hate rhetoric and hate speech. Moreover, post passage of legislation, it increases the ability for the free market of ideas to actually be an exchange. Much of the regulation will come from many diverse perspectives of many different backgrounds and academic knowledges coming together on large platforms so that if misinformation does arise, it can be easily refuted in visible ways that aren't likely on smaller, more condensed social media platforms like a Gab or like on deep underground internet forums. It is clear that a piece of legislation that would ensure equal protection of free speech on social media platforms is key to ensure our fundamental rights, prevent misinformation and echo chambers that lead to actual violence, and ensure accountability for everyone, including social media companies.
The negative team, please start your closing argument.
Let's begin with our opponents. Our opponents say that we need to have free public forums, but they don't address that public forums always require some form of regulation. This is a step backwards, not forwards, in regulating those public forums appropriately. The First Amendment protects hateful speech specifically, and it does nothing to address the problems with misinformation, which is why we need some form of regulation, which this resolution would completely halt. Our opponents say that we are promoting misinformation and echo chambers, but the evidence shows that it's actually the opposite, that if we do not regulate, you end up with misinformation that fragments truth, and both sides are just content to say that the other side has their facts wrong. This blank check protection would stop any regulation to prevent this. Amplification is the real problem here. As the FBI director explained and our other evidence explained, that on social media, these misinformation claims spread rapidly and rampantly if we do not check them with some form of regulation. And so this fragmenting of truth has really negative consequences that we will go over when I get to our side of the arguments. Our opponents say that there shouldn't be arbitrary regulation from the tech companies. And we agree that the government should get involved here. It just shouldn't get involved taking a step backwards to prevent any regulation at all. It should be involved taking a step forward to create these standards that need to be put in place. This in no way creates objective standards. It just puts blank check protections, which stops regulation in the future. Our opponents want accountability. Well, then you should be voting for the negative side. If we are to have accountability, for example, like news organizations have, because social media is becoming the news organizations of the future, you need to allow some form of regulation, because otherwise, for example, you couldn't take them to court in a future date if they were spreading misinformation or harmful information, because they could just back up to this law and say, hey, it is completely protected. I can't stop this at all. So in terms of framing, the definition of political viewpoint provided by the Supreme Court is very broad and includes matters of opinion. So it's a blank check. The affirmative is advocating that all this kinds of content gets protection on private platforms, and there are serious problems with this because, one, misinformation is disguised as a political opinion. As the Brookings Institution explains, misinformation spreads rapidly and unchecked on social media platforms, and political misinformation divides us and halts discourse between groups. Furthermore, Paul Kerr shows that political misinformation harms democratic engagement. We want more democratic engagement, not less. Second, which leads into that political misinformation harms democracy. A large percentage of Americans are getting their news from social media. And as Jennifer Jarrett explains, misinformation is a threat to transparent information and an informed public. James Hollier further explains that transparent information is critical for maintaining democratic, peaceful transitions of power. That is what is under threat here. That's what we saw in the Capitol riots, and it's something that we need to address head on, not back off from. Third, legislation would legitimize political extremism. As FBI Director Christopher Wray explained, social media is an amplifier for domestic violent extremism, and this would provide blank check protection to these extremists to use this platform. The First Amendment does not stop hateful language. It only stops direct and imminent calls to violence, which is not enough here, and we need to have moderation on these platforms. And finally, something that our opponents don't really address at all head on is that this would destroy the freedom of association that these private websites are entitled to. A private company, like a person, retains the right to dissociate from something that they disagree with. And social media companies should be treated more like news organizations that currently, I will remind you, have this freedom to dissociate and not have people spreading messages using the megaphone of their platforms to say what they want. They need the right to freely associate, just like news companies, so we can have accountability in the future. So in conclusion, the definition of political viewpoint is extremely broad. Our opponents do not contest this. We are writing a blank check protection for this. The affirmative is allowing extremely harmful types of speech, specifically misinformation, to go unchecked. Instead, we need to be protecting democracy by regulating misinformation that harms discourse. And we need to be regulating extremist views on these platforms that are being used as a megaphone. So if you want to step forward into the 21st century and actually provide solutions to these terrible challenges that our nation is facing, we cannot step backwards and provide a blank check protection for these harmful forms of speech. I would urge a strong vote in the negation.
Thank you. I want to thank the students for a really good debate. You guys were remarkable, and thank you the judges for listening, and we will post the results on the April website. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much for judging.
Good round, guys. It was really good.
Yeah.
Good night, guys. Thanks for judging, everyone.
Thank you for judging.
Everybody.